together? Good God, may the words that I speak, the thoughts and insights of our hearts and minds be acceptable to you, you who are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A couple of years ago, I was interviewing with a church in Arizona for an interim position. It was a very unusual circumstance. The senior pastor of this large church had just committed suicide. And they had two other pastors there, but they had other roles. They needed someone to come in and kind of stabilize things and right the boat, but they were very concerned about the kind of person they were going to bring in. And when they interviewed me, they said to me, "We want you to understand, we're looking for someone who is very meek." That was the exact word they used. Someone who is very meek, someone who is comfortable just working quietly behind the scenes. We're interested in someone who doesn't need to be in the spotlight. And I said, well, not being in the spotlight is no problem. Been there, done that. And I'm happy to work behind the scenes. That's just fine. But I have to honestly tell you that never once in my entire life have I thought of myself as being meek. The truth of it is, I don't know about you, but when I hear that word, I don't have real positive impressions. I think of somebody who is afraid of their own shadow. Someone who cowers at the very thought of a confrontation. Someone who just isn't able to stand up for anything, even for themselves. We live in a very aggressive culture where assertiveness is valued, even to the point of selfishness. We live in a culture that is saturated in violence. And so it's hard for us to make any real sense of these words from Jesus. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That just doesn't appeal to me very much. But if we're going to try to make sense of what Jesus had to say, I think the two passages that I've read for you this morning at least begin to give us a handle on that. The first one, of course, from Numbers. This takes place when the people of Israel are wandering in the wilderness. Moses and his brother Aaron and their sister Miriam are the leaders of the Jewish people in this journey. They're all working hard to bring the people of God to a new land. But Moses is getting all the press. Moses is getting all the credit. And by the time this incident takes place, Miriam and Aaron have had it right up to here. They are sick to death of hearing about Moses and how terrific Moses is and what a gifted leader Moses is. They are just done with it. And one day, Moses actually does something wrong. He marries a foreign woman, which was strictly against the law of Judaism in that time. And Aaron and Miriam are delighted. They are thrilled. Oh, Moses isn't so perfect after all. Maybe the golden boy does have a flaw or two. Maybe he's not the only one who can lead the people of God. Maybe it's time that he stepped back and we step up. And they did their very best to foment discord and to create gossip and to bring Moses down a notch. And of course, God will have none of it. And God intervenes in a rather dramatic way, sets the record clear, strikes Miriam with leprosy to make it clear that he does not tolerate this kind of behavior. Now, as a modern reader of Scripture, I have a lot of trouble with this passage. I have a lot of difficulty with what it portrays. First of all, how it portrays God as this rather vindictive, hard-nosed God that will crush you in a moment if you disagree. But then also, what's with this Aaron and Miriam do exactly the same thing? Yeah. They both commit the same offense. Miriam is struck with leprosy. Aaron is off scot-free. What kind of chauvinism is this? It's almost as if maybe a guy wrote the book. So, as we often need to do when we read Scripture, and especially when we read Old Testament Scripture, we need to put aside some of those peripheral issues and ask ourselves, what really is the point here? Why is this story in the Bible? What are we being taught? And the point of this passage, I think, comes to us in verse 3, where it says, "And Moses was a very meek man, meeker than any person on the face of the earth." Now, when we look at Moses and his behavior, we might question that. Because this is the guy who went to Egypt and confronted the Pharaoh, the most powerful person in the entire world at that time, and wasn't afraid to speak truth to power. He also had no difficulty in leading the people of Israel, that motley crew, through the wilderness, and affirming them when that was appropriate, and disciplining them, and shaping them, and directing them when that was needed. So Moses was not a wimp. He was not a bowl of jelly that could be pushed around. And yet, we are told he was meek. This word that is translated in the King James Version as meek has several different words that could be used in English. One of them is meek, but equally appropriate would be gentle, or humble, or interestingly, devout. Think about that one. Devout. The point is that Moses is following God's command to lead the people of Israel, not because he chooses to, not because he's power hungry, but because God has called him. And if you recall, Moses initially said yes, only very reluctantly. He really didn't want to sign up for this job. But he has agreed to lead the people of God because he believes that that's what God has called him to do. Moses is never in it for himself. Moses never asks the question, what's in it for me? Moses never sits around and frets about what his legacy will be. His goal is purely and simply to do what he believes God has called him to do. When we turn to the second passage in Philippians, the author takes it even a step further. And of course, the author of this passage is Paul. Goes even further down this road of meekness, as he uses Jesus as an example of how we should live. He says, Do nothing out of selfish ambition or out of vain egotism. In humility, value others above yourself, looking not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Now that's a bit much, don't you think? I mean, if he had said, look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others, well, we could probably swallow that. Maybe we couldn't always live it, but we could at least understand that that would make sense. But that isn't what he says. He says, look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. Put others first. Don't be worried about yourself. Don't be agitated or concerned about your reputation. Care about others. Now, I always find it ironic that Paul was the guy who wrote this passage. Because this is a classic example of a preacher who knows the right answer and is totally incapable of living it. There are numerous examples in Paul's letter where he spends a great amount of time telling people why he's the best apostle, why he is superior to the others. And he does it with some regularity, and may I say, with absolutely no humility. Paul knows how we're supposed to live, following the example of Christ, but at least in this realm, he's not a good example. And I can really relate to Paul. Because when I read this passage, I think to myself, are you kidding? You really expect me to do that? To put the interests of others ahead of my own interests? I can do that once in a while. The occasional altruistic act where I put my desires, my schedule, my priorities, my wants to the side and do something just because it's the right thing to do for someone else or for some other group. But that's the exception. That's not how I typically operate. Mostly I'm looking out for my interests. There's an old saying, and some people say that it was Harry Truman who first said it. Others say it was Ronald Reagan. Still others say it was a 19th century Jesuit priest. I'll let you decide. But the saying is this, and it is a great summary, I think, of what this particular beatitude is really all about. The saying is, there is no limit to what you can accomplish when you don't care who gets the credit. It's amazing what you can do when you don't care who gets the credit. Jesus said, blessed are the meek, the humble, the gentle, the devout, for they will inherit the earth. Well, why will they inherit the earth? Why will God put them in charge of God's reign? Because God can trust them. Because they're not looking out for number one. Because they're involved in God's reign and God's family, not for what is in it for them, but because they are called to do that. And because they believe in the life, they believe in the value system to which God has called them. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Holy Spirit.